Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fourth episode of our webinar series, Behind the Scenes with Lion Landscapes. My name is Paul Subi. I'm the communication assistant at Lion Landscapes, based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I will be your host for today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speakers, Lion Landscapes joint CEOs, Alayne Cotterill and Amy Dickman. In this episode, we'll be exploring alternative mechanisms to increase the benefits for communities coexisting with large carnivores. Alayne and Amy will delve into our land-friendly livestock, carbon and biodiversity credits, and land landscapes' proactive involvement in ensuring that large carnivores and local communities are effectively integrated into this rapid evolving arena. Now, this will be done in form of a few questions that I will be asking our speakers directly. To our attendees, you too will have an opportunity to engage our speakers by using the Q&A feature. We will answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of this session. Please note, we will only answer questions submitted in the Q&A function. Alayne, Amy, thank you very much for joining us. So I'll get straight into it. I'll ask the first set of questions to Amy. Amy, Lion Landscape's mission is to make large carnivore conservation valuable to local and global communities. Can you explain why it is important to distinguish local and global communities in this context?
Yes, thanks, Paul, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. The reason, Paul, that we have to think about both global and local communities is because of all the diverse types of value that large carnivores and general conservation can have. If you look at the history of sort of human relationships with species like large carnivores, it shows a really diverse array of value. Everything from the fact the first figurative arts, the first time that people carved art out of woolly mammoth ivory about 40,000 years ago, that was the head of a lion on a human body. So it showed that right back then there was cultural value ascribed to lions, and we see that kind of value all the way through to today. If you look around, you can see lions in any city. I often, if I'm wandering around an airport or something, I'll look and I'll see where the next lion I see is, and it's always close by. They're on sports teams, they're on luxury goods, they're on all these kinds of areas, because lions and other big cats, but particularly lions and other, as well as other wildlife, have all this cultural value that we ascribe to them. But it goes beyond cultural value. Sometimes there's lots of economic value associated with the presence of wildlife. And traditionally, that's been in forms such as phototourism or trophy hunting, where often foreign investors then tend to take the bulk of those, not always, but often tend to take the bulk of those profits externally. So they're using a value that's generated by outsiders, and often the value goes back to outsiders. And there's also value that's held locally at a local level. But at that value, it might be cultural value, it might be existence value, that people just love having these animals around. But at that level, they don't tend to get too much of the financial value back down to that level. And that's a real problem in conservation, and why we're not seeing quite enough investment and action at a local level for conservation. And so it's really, really important that we take this huge international value ascribed to wildlife in general and big cats in particular, and think about better mechanisms that we can translate that value right down to the local people, because the local people are the ones that are suffering the costs of that wildlife. And much as we all might think that lions and other animals are beautiful, they are also very dangerous and difficult to live with. So it's really vital that we think of these new mechanisms, and also make sure they are mechanisms that are directly linked to the presence of that wildlife. So it's not just having a national park there or having a project there that helps give maybe benefits to local people. It's making sure those benefits are directly linked to being a result of maintaining wildlife on that land. And that's where some of these new sort of financial models that we and other partners are working on, we think will add to that ability, so that we can take that international value and make it much more effective at a local level to drive conservation.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Yes, as we try to link this value to the wildlife, how does Lion Landscapes help to unlock that particular value for the local communities?
We do it in many different ways. We are very privileged because Alayne and I and many others in Lion Landscapes have access to this external, often foreign group of people who have a very economic value towards wildlife. So they have access to resources, to interest, to funding that we need to channel down to the local level. So we can act as a bridge between that international community and the villagers and the communities that we work with on the ground who live alongside these lions. And then we have to make sure that the value and the way that is translated to those local people is the way that they want and they value. It can't be the way that we think it needs to be done. It has to be understanding the situations they live in, the needs that they have, and how they most want to see that value of wildlife translated down to the local level. So that's kind of what we do. We act as this conduit between the international level and the local level. And fundamentally, because we are working on the ground, because we live and work, and all our teams, as you know, work right there on the ground with local communities, it means we can take that local perspective and translate it back up to that international community, and then co-develop ways that we can have these new mechanisms to incentivize conservation at a local level. And that takes multiple ways. We make sure that we reduce the costs that people have at a local level, and then we increase some of the benefits. And overall, if we switch that cost-benefit ratio, hopefully people will see more actual tangible value to having this wildlife there, and then be more incentivized to coexist and to have effective conservation.
Okay, still on that benefit, you spoke about this benefit. Now, are these benefits that Lion Landscapes are working on to link to wildlife presence always financial? These benefits that are being, linked to the presence of wildlife that then the community gets to benefit from, are they always financial?
Yeah, it's a great question, and they're not always financial. As I mentioned, these values tend to take multiple forms. People want to just be around wildlife and experience wildlife, including big cats. And so one of the benefit programs, for example, we have, even though it's not what people might originally think of as a benefit, because they tend to think of the financial ones, is things like the park trip. So this is a way of enabling people to go in and to experience wildlife and to be close to wildlife and to have that sort of shared presence and that kind of existence value right there in a non-threatening way. We also engage local warriors, for example, and try to co-develop programs with them where their cultural value associated with lions, the fact that lions are a vehicle for where you can demonstrate bravery, for where you can show that you're an important component of your community, we develop sort of mechanisms with them so that that cultural value with lions can be reflected through our conservation programming, through things like our Lion Defenders programs, for example. And we also have things like our storybooks. So this is, ways that we've worked with the community to think about how to center them at the center of this conservation story and make sure that their role is represented, they themselves are represented, they see themselves in the conservation outputs and at the heart of kind of what we're trying to do. So all of those kinds of things are non-financial benefits associated with the programs, but the financial ones are very, very important as well. People ultimately need to have development. They need to have development because of conservation, not in spite of conservation. And that's what a lot of these mechanisms we'll be talking about are focused on.
Thank you, Emmy. That's an elaborate explanation. Thank you for that. So I'll switch to you, Alayne. Can you give some examples of how large carnivore conservation can add financial value to local communities? I know Emmy has mentioned quite a bit. Maybe you could tell us some more.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And first of all, let me apologise. I've got a horrendous cold and cough. So if I have a coughing fit, you'll just have to forgive me. But yeah, as Amy mentioned, there's, historically, really the only benefits have gone to communities from living near tourism or active conservation or research activities such as employment, sometimes conservation fees, and all these philanthropic benefits that Amy has been mentioning that projects like ours can give to the local communities. But at the end of the day, quite often these are just not enough to outweigh the heavy costs of living with these large carnivores. And they're not spread wide enough. They're often patchy where these projects exist. And they're also, maybe some individuals benefit and some families benefit, but not others. So as Amy mentions, we desperately need new sort of financial mechanisms that allow the conservation of healthy ecosystems, including dangerous and difficult species to live with, like large carnivores, to drive sustainable development for local communities rather than hinder that kind of development. So currently, really the only mechanism that gives real value to nature conservation is the carbon market. And projects that either remove carbon from the atmosphere or reduce emissions from deforestations can sell tons of carbon that their actions lock away in nature to those whose actions are causing carbon to be emitted. Carbon projects give the conservation of forests and well-managed grassland and some marine ecosystems real tangible value. However, the carbon market does not value wider biodiversity in its own right. So there's some competitive advantage gained for carbon projects that can be verified to also benefit conservation of some key wildlife species, but biodiversity itself is just not valued. And excitingly for wildlife conservation, biodiversity credits are now being developed as standalone credits or stacked carbon biodiversity credits. And these are based on frameworks much more robust biodiversity conservation metrics. And these will give a direct value to the conservation of wider biodiversity in its own right.
Okay, thank you, Alayne. You just mentioned biodiversity credits, and in Lion Landscape's most recent blog, there is the mention of Lion Friendly Livestock. Could you explain what this is exactly?
Yeah, Lion Friendly Livestock works in a different way to these kind of ecosystem services that I've just mentioned. It's actually one of a growing number of conservation certifications, and which really help to link verifiable wildlife conservation outcomes to increase value for existing products. In this case, livestock raised on rangelands with conservation outcomes that secure biodiversity all the way up to the top carnivores. Certified producers can advertise that fact and hopefully attract bigger buyers. And this could shorten supply chains, increase profits that way, and also have a competitive advantage over other suppliers that can't demonstrate the same conservation outcomes. So in this way, certification incentivizes livestock producers to use practices that benefit the conservation of nature, including large carnivores. It's really a program that livestock producers can join, and they can measure their impacts and adaptively manage for improvements rather than just a kind of cut and dry certification only. And additionally, the Lion Friendly Livestock program works to share the latest know-how between those that are already lion friendly and those that aren't. So in this way, we can support areas sort of on the outsides of and beyond the borders of these lion friendly certified properties as well.
Okay, still on the Lion Friendly Livestock, and we're still focusing on your blog. There is a presentation of the criteria that livestock producers have to meet in order to be certified lion friendly. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. The presence of voracious carnivores like African lion does not really seem conducive to livestock rearing, but coexistence between pastoralist people and large carnivores has been possible, although not without conflict, for a very long time on African rangelands. So after years of studying lions and living among lions on human and livestock dominated landscapes, we've really boiled down what they need to coexist with people and livestock to 5 key categories. And these are space, prey, tolerance, habitat refuge, and connectivity. Under space, we encourage herding practices that encourage the concentration of livestock activity in one place at any one time, leaving the majority of the rangeland undisturbed for lions and other wildlife to use. Prey criteria ensure that wildlife species are at sufficient densities and well distributed across the landscape to support large carnivore populations. And then the tolerance criteria ensure that any killing of livestock by large carnivores and any killing of large carnivores by people, which does sometimes happen, is minimized and sustainable. Refuge habitat criteria make sure that there are always patches of dense bush or rocky ground where large carnivores can go while people are active on the landscape, and that way hide and remain undetected, which is very important to large carnivores like lions. And then also another thing that's really important is the connectivity criteria. And this really ensures that lion-friendly properties are connected to other suitable habitat at a scale which is viable for populations of large carnivores to be supported on the landscape. Together, these LFL criteria make sure that all these categories, sort of 5 key factors for lions to coexist with people and livestock, are in place. And these are from the lion's perspective, obviously. Happily, the practices needed for Lion Friendly also improve grass production too, and serve better for livestock.
That's interesting. So you just explained that Lion Friendly Livestock is not just about lions. You mentioned the large carnivores. Can you tell us more about how lions work as some sort of kind of an umbrella species?
Yeah, lions are an apex carnivore, so they're actually a great symbol for healthy biodiverse ecosystems, because healthy populations of lions need healthy prey, which needs healthy habitat, which in turn needs healthy soils. And lions are also the hardest wildlife species to coexist with for pastoralist people. So practices that protect livestock from lions normally protect livestock from other large carnivores too. So viable population of wild lions in a landscape symbolize healthy prey, habitat, soils, and also well-managed human-carnivore conflict. Also, lion-friendly livestock is an important complement to the development of these ecosystem services income streams that we're talking about today as well, like carbon and biodiversity credits on African rangelands, because it really encourages the practices that directly result in the better carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation, which is really essential to be able to benefit from these ecosystem services payments. So lion-friendly producers will be able to sell more carbon and biodiversity credits, creating some layers of added value linked to carnivore conservation.
Thank you, Alayne, for that insight into the lion-friendly livestock. I'll turn back to you, Amy. Recently, there is a lot of talk about biodiversity credits. Can you explain to us what biodiversity credits are and how they work?
The short answer to that is no, because I don't think anyone can truly answer what a biodiversity credit actually is and how it works, because they're still so conceptual in many cases at the moment. But I can give you the broad brush, and it's really important when we're talking about this, as we'll be touching on through the rest of the webinar, is that Alayne and I, and as you know, the whole team at Lion Landscapes we're not economists, we are not credit developers. This isn't our area of expertise, but we've seen, as we'll talk about a bit later, we've seen this growing interest in credit markets and what it might mean, and we are very excited by it and looking to get more involved. But to try to answer your question, basically biodiversity credits are meant to be a financial mechanism where you put a financial value on nature. And then that might be a species, it might be a group of species, it might be an area. How to quantify it is very difficult and the source of lots and lots of debate. There's many different discussions about how you might want to properly value it. Yes, there's lots of discussions around that. But basically what it's trying to do is to create and leverage a market, basically, which is about nature restoration rather than destroying nature. Most of our economic markets so far have existed, unfortunately, to destroy nature. That wasn't their intention, but that's because, if you value things like gold, you've got to mine it. If you value, cutting down, old growth forests, then obviously you destroy nature in that way. And so this is trying to incentivize people by putting that financial value on the intact ecosystems, and so all these systems that you would like to become more intact and restored, so that people, companies, private individuals, governments even, can actually start to invest in those areas to maintain the existing biodiversity and then to restore it as well. And that will have eventually a financial value ascribed to it. And if that value increases over time, then there's a reason for companies, say, to get involved to buy credits now. And if the value of that credit goes up in future years, then they've had a financial return on it. And one of the reasons behind this is that to expand the pot of people who are interested in financing biodiversity conservation at a significant level, we've got a huge funding gap in conservation. And it's mainly been funded by state funding, often inadequately in range countries in particular, because governments don't have enough funding for it, but also by philanthropy, as Alayne's touched on. So we've got to think about how do we engage the private sector more into biodiversity conservation. And the development of this credit market, I think, is a really interesting one that we are seeing much more interested in, and just seeing how those mechanisms can be developed to put a proper financial value on maintaining and restoring nature.
Thank you, Amy. You just mentioned, involving stakeholders more into these biodiversity credits. I would want to know from a landscapes perspective, how is land landscapes rather getting involved in the development of these biodiversity credits?
Thanks, Paul. Well, one of the key aspects of these biodiversity credits is that you have to have clear, verifiable frameworks. People aren't going to buy into this unless you have a clear framework saying this is the biodiversity impact that I'm investing in, and this is the metric that shows that it's either being maintained or restored. And so as we are thinking from the Lion Landscapes point of view, a big part of what we're doing is trying to think, what would those metrics look like from a lion conservation, a large carnivore conservation, and particularly a community-based conservation perspective. So it's thinking about the fact that, people are aware of, for instance, carbon credits and the metrics. Alayne touched on the fact that a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, and that makes it relatively simple, although there's lots of complexity around carbon credits that we'll probably touch on later. But basically, we need to think about how do we develop those metrics. We don't want empty forests. We don't want to just address the climate crisis. We need to also address the biodiversity crisis. And so from Lion Landscapes' point of view, as a conservation organisation, we go into it with several different views. We go into it to think, what are the metrics that we need if these credits were accurately going to reflect good lion conservation? So, for example, it can't just be the number of lions if you had a lion credit, because then something like a South African lion farm would be the most valuable credit. And that's not what we want. We don't want lots and lots of lions and nothing else. We want extensive range where you've got healthy populations of prey, healthy populations of large carnivores, and local people who are empowered by the presence of that wildlife. So we need to think about what's the most appropriate metrics. We also need to think about how you make sure that the communities who live alongside these animals are properly engaged as really fair stakeholders, that these things aren't developed at 30,000 feet and imposed upon them. Thinking about just the fact that how do you incentivize and enable those people to maintain the assets they've got, and then also actually take steps in terms of behavioral change that lead towards towards active change, towards maintaining that biodiversity. So we're bringing in our expertise such that it is about the understanding of the complexity of conservation on the ground, how difficult it is to live alongside species like lions, and then thinking about how actually we can translate this into a way that speaks to financial markets. If they want one simple metric about this, what at our level needs to underpin that to make sure it's a holistic solution for communities and for wildlife conservation?
Indeed, thank you for those solutions. Now, I'll get back to you again, Alayne. There has been quite a lot of negative press around carbon credits and offsetting lately. How is this impacting work in this field?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, a challenging question. And there are challenges linked to the carbon market, many of which are likely to be amplified in any biodiversity market that's developed. So these are really important to consider. There are concerns about additionality. Would emissions reductions and removals happen anyway without the sale of carbon offsets? And also things like leakage. Do emission reductions in one place lead to increased emissions in another place? Does deforestation pressure just move? And that's going to be very similar with some biodiversity conservation issues as well. But the methodologies around measuring and valuing carbon and conservation is really improving over time and constantly evolving, helping to relieve some of these worries. But as Amy said, it's going to be really important for biodiversity credits to have those really good and transparent frameworks behind them so people can see exactly what's being done. There will always be cowboy projects, but technological improvements are leading to greater transparency as well for buyers, so data can be really shared very easily. And initial carbon prices, another challenge was that they were just really too low and did not properly offset the damage done by emitters. But pricing is often low in a new undeveloped market. And so the value of a ton of carbon is moving in the right direction as the market matures. Likely to be similar with biodiversity, that the prices will be relatively low to start with, will hopefully increase as the sort of trust in this market grows. There's also worries that offsetting stops people or companies from reducing their emissions of carbon. However, as carbon offsets increase in value, it just won't make sense, won't make financial sense not to reduce emissions as much as possible. And it certainly won't make sort of sustainability sense either. So the bottom line is that nothing so far has come close to creating as much value for nature conservation and the people that are bearing the costs of living alongside wildlife as the carbon market. So we need people and communities to build wealth from conservation of nature, not just be slightly less poor, as Amy has already mentioned earlier. So actions that damage the carbon market or developing biodiversity market, they sort of, well, I guess they sort of make us feel a little bit desperate as conservationists who work on the front line, because I think we believe that payments for these kind of ecosystem services are currently the best hope that we've got for nature conservation by a long way. So damaging them feels like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay. Yes, indeed. Looking at how well you've explained these, involving the communities at the center of this all, and we can go on and on with the, biodiversity credits, and how the carbon credits are being offset. So we would want to get back to the theme of this webinar and try to understand, do these developments mean there is real hope for making large carnivore conservation valuable for local communities? Alayne?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. In short, yes. And so multiple value streams linked to wildlife presence and verifiable conservation impacts creates resilience in nature conservation. And that's what we really need, because no one income stream, be it philanthropy or tourism or carbon or biodiversity or wildlife certification, none of these alone are likely to be a silver bullet for conservation. But the more value streams we can choose from, the more likely at least one of those or a suite of those will fit all the areas that are really important for lion and other large carnivores. And where you can get multiple streams of income, then working in concert, more value can be created. And as we've spoken about earlier, and we speak about regularly, this is really important because there are lots of real costs linked to living with large carnivores that need to be outweighed. So technology development is also allowing us not only to measure conservation impacts better, but to give greater transparency in data collection and sharing. And Amy mentioned that, and I've mentioned that already as well, of how important these clear metrics are and the transparency of how we're working towards those metrics and how well any project's doing. So camera trap, acoustic monitors, environmental DNA techniques, and so then the development of AI that can really analyze and display vast amounts of data in real time or almost real time will allow investors to know exactly what they're getting in the way of nature conservation for their money and really build trust in these developing markets. Overall, new income streams linked to the conservation of nature can only be good, right? Even if they're less than perfect to start with and will require a process of ongoing improvement over time, we both feel that it's important not to let perfection be the enemy of progress, but to really embrace these new opportunities and work to make them better.
Yeah, indeed. Embracing technology and seeing how that can, create real benefit in conservation is the way to go. Thank you. Alayne, Emmy, I can talk about this with you all evening, but let's now turn to the audience, to our dear attendees. As I've seen some questions coming in, so I want to focus now on the questions at the Q&A session, Q&A feature. We have quite a few that are already in. Just request those who would have some questions to type them in the Q&A feature, and then we'll be taking them as we carry on. Now, the first question, from an anonymous attendee: is Lion Landscapes offsetting their carbon footprint? I don't know who will take that.
Yes, we are offsetting. In fact, we're doing more than that. We're double offsetting. So we're offsetting double what we need to. So we're more than 100% positive. And we're doing that with Biocarbon Partners. That is a project that we've partnered with in Zambia to add some very clear biodiversity monitoring metrics to their carbon project so that they can demonstrate very clearly that the carbon project that they're doing and the carbon and forest conservation work that they're doing is also leading to real biodiversity conservation impacts as well. So we're very confident that that's a project that is very far from a cowboy project. It's the opposite. It's having real conservation impacts. And so that's how we've chosen who to offset our work with.
Thank you, Alayne. Second question, again from an anonymous attendee. How long will it take for the first biodiversity credits to be on the market? And when do you think it will raise significant funds for conservation?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So there are already various biodiversity credits on the market. So there was and because they take lots of different forms, there are things like koala credits that are out there already. There was a rhino bond that was launched by the World Bank, I think last year. So there are various species-based ones that are, and the UK is looking quite a lot now about biodiversity credits with their house building, for example, with the idea that you shouldn't be able to destroy nature, you should be able to at least offset what you've got, and they're using biodiversity credits and offset to some extent with that. So there are already markets out there. The problem really is that there aren't that many frameworks around what actually constitutes a good biodiversity credit at the moment. And that's kind of the holy grail, is that you see these developments, the project, and the idea is there, but unless Alayne was talking about the risks, of course, with what we've seen with the carbon credit market, unless you've got really good frameworks around it, and biodiversity is so much more complicated, that's got to be resolved and thought through very carefully before actually you're going to get the market investment, before you're going to get people wanting to actually scale this up. So I think it's a little way off before we will see it scale up where it's having really significant impacts in biodiversity financing. And also there's lots of discussions about why people would need to do it. Is there a sufficient market, if it's just a voluntary market, to do this kind of investing? So, you know, a lot of the carbon credits now, people are actually, you know, there's rules that say you have to do it in various companies, and it's moving more towards companies having to look at their biodiversity impacts and eventually having to disclose biodiversity impacts. And that disclosure is very public discussion of biodiversity impacts will then drive companies to want to offset or to buy credits and to do things like that. So it's a very evolving market. I think in the next 5 years, we will see some really significant changes in this. But it has to be done carefully, because what you don't want, Alayne talked about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you don't want people to race just to be the first past the post to get these things out there, and then for it to be discredited and say that biodiversity credits aren't useful, because there is real value here, but it needs to be thought through, and it's better to be careful than it is to be fast in some of these markets, I think.
Oh, thank you, Emmy. Another question from, again, another anonymous attendee. Is Lion Friendly Livestock only being developed in Laikipia, or is it an African-wide initiative? Alayne, you can take that.
So we're just developing it in Laikipia for the moment, because we're testing it and seeing how well it works. At the moment, we don't know how, you know, are people going to care if livestock and their products are Lion friendly or not? And I think in the West, there has been quite a lot of proof that conservation branding does add value to products. People are starting to be more choosy about buying their meats and buying other products based on conservation issues around them. But certainly in most of Africa today, people are not willing to pay more for their meat. They want quality, and pricing is very important. So, I mean, to start with, at this point, we're just going to be developing it to build CSR. So it just gives competitive advantage. And if people can sell to, you know, maybe to bigger buyers as well, and then that can cut the chain down and increase profits that way. But, you know, it's early stages, and we're watching it with interest.
Thank you, Alayne. Another question from Team Tesla. How long and where is a likely market for lion-friendly beef? How much higher is the cost for these interested consumers? Thank you for that question, Tim.
Yeah, so that goes back to what I just mentioned, really, is that we're not going to be looking at increasing the prices of meat, because I think at the moment, if you put meat on the shelves in many African countries, and particularly in Kenya, where we've done a little bit of market research on this, then people are not going to go, oh, I'm going to be able to spend that bit extra and get the Lion friendly one. So I think we're not looking at having more expensive meat. What we're looking at is having people with wanting to buy it with the same price, same quality, but also having this real CSR value, and knowing that it has the real conservation impact. So just getting that competitive advantage rather than the higher pricing at the moment. And then maybe when the market develops more, there will be an ability to actually have, you know, higher pricing as well. but I definitely don't think that's going to be the first step that we take.
Okay, thank you for that clarity, Alayne. Another question from Sylvia Seppi. The number of people sharing their landscapes with lions has exponentially increased in the past 50 years, and generally subsistence pastoralists' living conditions deteriorated while their vulnerability has increased. It will take an even bigger effort to lift large populations from extreme poverty. Is there really a new balance to be found between people and the collapsing lion population through carbon and biodiversity credits? Are these credits going to be valued at a much higher price compared to carbon credits? I hope so. That's a question from Sylvia. Sylvia, thank you for that interesting question. Yeah, I'll take that.
Okay, I'll start with that. Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, really interesting question. You highlight some obviously vital things that we think about all the time. You know, lion populations and other wildlife are crashing. Human populations alongside them are living in real poverty. You know, where is the financial mechanism to change this? And in short, your answer, I really do think this is a really exciting time where these credits can make a hugely significant difference. And the amount of money we're talking about to change these things isn't that much when you look at the global market. So, for example, there's an analysis that looked at the funding gap at the moment for lions within protected areas, and most lions are within protected areas, although of course we work a lot with the lions around the outside, and that funding gap was probably between $1.5 and $2 billion a year, which sounds a lot to us as conservationists, but actually when you're looking at financial markets, it's tiny. And I think it was HSBC, don't quote me on this, that was just saying they were looking at developing biodiversity credits to the tune of about 5 billion, I think, over the next few years. So there's lots of money. I was just in New York at the Earthshot Prize Summit and talking to a lot of financiers there. There's real interest, still strong and growing interest in the carbon markets, and increasingly awareness of how to integrate biodiversity into these markets. So I think the money is out there, and I think it could very much be used to uplift people out of poverty, but it's got to be designed well. And you've got to balance this kind of thing between governments have got to be incentivized to maintain these huge areas of wildlife. You know, you look at somewhere like Tanzania, and more than a third of its land is set aside as protected areas, and most of it doesn't make any money. So why are governments putting aside that much land if it's not making the money? So there's got to be part of that credit to incentivize governments. And one of the big things we're working on is particularly around the edges and outside protected areas. How do you formulate credits in a way that properly incentivizes local people to take those actions and lift them out of poverty, and make sure that the mechanisms should be about their behaviors so that they can own the credit and it couldn't be taken away from an external party and managed that way. So it's a long answer, but I think there's real hope there. And I think how effectively it can do it really depends on the structure of those frameworks, as much as the pricing internationally for it.
Okay, very well. Thank you for that elaborate explanation, Emmy. Just to encourage our participants, our attendees, those who still have questions can type them in the Q&A feature. Yes, I'll take hopefully this last one if there is no more questions coming. Do you think there is a need, this is from an anonymous attendee again, do you think there is a need for funding to help great organizations like yours to evaluate and align their projects to biodiversity market opportunities? What does that work look like? And what do you think the budget for a project to do this work would be? Thank you for that interesting question. Yeah.
Alayne, who do you want to take it?
No. No. Yeah, no, I'm happy to take it. No, I think there definitely is a need for financing this, because the development of these, as Amy has said, is so important, such an important stage. So we do need to take that time and care into developing something really meaningful. What does that work look like? That's something that we're really working through ourselves at the moment. And so we don't have a clear answer on that. But I mean, maybe Amy, you might have some better answers on that leading into the next question as well. But in terms of a budget, that's going to depend from project to project. So that's a little bit, how long is a piece of string? But I think with the development of these things, we are looking at millions rather than thousands. But as Amy mentioned, there is a lot of money out there, and once it gets, once these are developed, then that money should get back and be really worth doing. And so I think developing projects depends how big they are, but I think it is going to take significant investment.
Yeah, definitely. I know that Cheryl wants to weigh in as well here, but and I think it's a really interesting question, and one that there is this capacity gap between projects like ours that do field conservation work and then interest from the financial sector in funding conservation, but often those two don't speak the same languages, they don't have the same aims. So we need to think about how do we not only develop the metrics, but develop mechanisms for those discussions to happen. I was recently at a meeting when the financiers were talking about how they really wanted to invest more in conservation, but to them, the issue was not enough good projects. And I said, from our point of view, it's completely different. There are all these good projects, and we don't have any mechanisms to people like HSBC or, the big development banks to do it. So I think one of the ways that is slightly non-financial is to think of more partnerships. How do we partner with corporate entities, with banks, with development banks, with things like the IUCN Finance Lab, maybe, to make those connections so that we start speaking the same language and recognizing what we each have to offer and how to join it up a bit more. So I think that's something that could be really valuable to do and something we're only just starting to look at. Indeed. Cheryl, did you want to add something?
Just what you said, absolutely. It is corporate partnerships that are vital to be holding up these initiatives, these ideas, and to have them offsetting their carbon and their biodiversity as a partnership with charities like ours, then it's just really going to fill that gap and will be so beneficial. So yeah, that's what we're working on, and we're going to get there.
Thank you, Cheryl. Indeed, it's a work in progress. And with that answer, we conclude this webinar. Thanks to you all for the questions, and thank you, Amy and Alayne, for sharing your views of these really exciting ideas, to develop, value and benefit for the local community.
Oh, there's one more question.
There's another question.
Yeah, I just seen a question pop up. Sorry. I'll answer that from John. A question from John. Can the funding of education at the village level be connected to biodiversity credits? Thank you, John.
So yes, in short, I think very much so. I think the point of these things should be getting the funding into those people living alongside large carnivores and into their communities, and then they, of course, do with it as they want. And at a very micro level, the kind of incentives that we've developed so far at Lion Landscapes, things like our conservation contracts, take that same model where we reward people for the presence of wildlife there through things like our camera trapping projects, and then those go to local initiatives based on their priorities. And the priority of education is always really high. People want their children to have good education, so then they use the credits, the credit equivalent there, to help fund education. So I think very much it could be a really good mechanism to deliver, as we've touched on, that human development needs through conservation rather than in spite of conservation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people see education as a way out of poverty as well. So they're very, very keen to see that as an outcome from their income that they get from these things.
Absolutely. Well said, Amy, Alayne. And thank you so much for attending our webinar, Behind the Scenes with Lion Landscapes. We hope you learned something useful. If you have any additional questions about our conservation work, please do not hesitate to contact us using the contact details that are being displayed on your screen. We'll let you know when we'll have the next episode of our webinar, and we hope you will join us. Thank you very much, and bye for now.